Okay, friends, here we are. I have prepared for you a little PowerPoint on the proofs for God. You've read, hopefully, some of the classical proofs in Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, and you're familiar now with how Newman goes about it. Uh, it's not exactly a proof, but it's sort of the fertile ground of a proof. That is his discovery of God in his conscience, his real apprehension of God in the life of conscience. This PowerPoint will discuss the classical proofs. It will also discuss a little bit of Newman, and it will also discuss Henri de Lubac and the first three chapters of his work, The Discovery of God. This opening little picture on the PowerPoint is from Rembrandt, and I like it as an image for the discovery of God because I think that it's an image of the discovery of the hidden treasure, like in the gospel parable. And I think that the discovery of God is like that, where you sort of discover it on the way to things. So he's busy about his activity, but then all of a sudden he's turned off to the side, and it's like the buried treasure in the sense that you sell everything, you buy the pearl of great price, you go bury it. uh, Everything is relativized before what you discover, because what you discover is the absolute. And I think that we all have an idea of God, as I've said before. We all have something we hold to as absolute, or we're just constantly drifting incoherently. um, but the only question is, what do you hold as absolute then? And a Christian would say that which he holds absolute is the true God, the origin of all things, the one who gives life and health to every existing thing, as opposed to something like an idol, something less than God, something that in fact is really only worthy of relative attention, not absolute attention. And when we give absolute attention to something that's only relative, it ends up having a destructive power over us. Think of something like money. If you treat money as if it's absolute, when in fact it is something that's only relative, it will destroy you. Same thing with the pursuit of something like pleasure. Pleasure is a good, but it's a relative good. If you make it absolute, the measuring rod by which you evaluate everything else, it will harm you, and so forth. So anyway, the discovery of God is like the discovery of that treasure which relativizes everything else. Okay, the presuppositions and goals of this little PowerPoint. I've got a few presuppositions. One is that I presume that the watcher of this has some familiarity already with classic proofs. So proofs for God's existence, for me, I consider classic are things like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, most especially. I also presuppose in this lecture that you think you're willing to join me in this assumption that it's possible to accept the validity of these proofs and yet still search for what makes them interiorly persuasive. That is, I presume that you're like me, where you read these proofs like the Five Ways of Aquinas, and you're like, gosh, I think that makes sense. That looks like a valid argument. There must be an unmoved mover. There must be a first efficient cause. Why is there something rather than nothing? Yeah, if I'm going to evaluate different gradations of perfection, there must be an absolute perfection by which they're all evaluated. And yeah, it does seem that everything around us does act with a certain intelligence. So if you understand those, I just enumerated there in short form the five ways. If you understand why those are valid, and yet you still feel in your own heart, it's like, is that it? Did I just find God? How come I didn't just fall down on my knees and become overwhelmed by the vision of this one? So if you're kind of caught with curiosity in that oddity between seeing what's valid formally in these proofs, but yet still, gosh, not feeling interiorly persuaded, where's that coming from? Okay, and goals in this, I want to look at quotations from Henri de Lubac and John Henry Newman in order to understand the origin of our idea of God, or the spiritual conditions necessary for understanding the classical proofs. in a way that really uncovers or allows us to deepen their interiorly persuasive character. So I think de Lubac and Newman will help us address that odd experience of reading the classical proofs and being like, okay, that makes sense, and yet still wondering, why am I not so powerfully moved yet? And then finally, I also want to look at some of the classical proofs, Anselm and Aquinas in particular, and see the role played by this idea of God in them. Okay, this is probably going to be a long one. I have way too many slides and way too much text on them, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, a couple, if you've read, I hope, the first 3 chapters of de Lubac's Discovery of God, I just want to throw out a few points that he makes just to have on the table. So de Lubac insists, and here he wants us to believe, and so far as I can tell, I think he's right, that he's really expressing the tradition on these points. He wants us to see that reason can see the light by which it sees. There is something sacred in our humble reason. That's a beautiful quote, I think. There's something sacred in our humble reason. And in a way, this whole presentation is about unpacking that line, namely that within the life of the mind, we see as a kind of constitutive principle of it, this apprehension of the light by which it sees, namely God. In that sense, he's always known by us in some way. Another point raised by de Lubac is one very similar to Polanyi, and in fact, the introduction to the PDF I gave you is an introduction by Schindler, a theologian, pretty famous theologian in the Communio school, and he points out that a lot of what de Lubac says in the Discovery of God bears great similarity to Polanyi, in this idea that we can know more than we can tell. De Lubac says on page 6 of the Discovery of God, he says that in his inmost being, made in the image of God, there is always something which he, man, is quite unable to represent to himself, though he is not without experience of it. And I think de Lubac is suggesting that this knowledge we have of God is something that we know, and it's more than we can tell. We experience it, we find it very persuasive, but we cannot translate it into representations that adequately express what it is that we know and experience. Okay, another point to throw out there is that human reason, or man in general, discovers himself as an image of what transcends him. And this is the powerful experience of one's own rationality that leads to a kind of a knowledge of God. And the beautiful line from the Psalm that de Lubac uses to express this is abyssus abyssum invocat, that abyss calls to abyss. It's a line from one of the Psalms. And he encourages us to, in order to discover God, to try to discover your own reality as a mirror and as an image. Know yourself by knowing your God. The more we know ourselves as mirrors of something that enlivens us, including the liven of the mind, the more we know ourselves as something constituted in relation to something transcendent that makes possible the life that we live, the more we will come to know ourselves as a deep, profound mystery, and the more we'll come to know the deep mystery of God. The abyssus, abyssum, the abyss, call to each other. And then finally, that our search for the origin of the idea of God should not mistake conditions for causes. So this is, I think, in broad sweep, his critique of a lot of philosophy of religion, which tries to reduce the idea of God to something produced in us by certain external factors. And whether it's difficult circumstances of life, or poverty, or joyful experiences, or something external to me that produces in me this idea of God. And so the genesis of the idea of God is not in reality or in the life of the mind itself, but in something induced into us from outside. De Lubac will say, okay, I don't want to dismiss the possibility that certain experiences of life can help us discover the idea of God, but let's not mistake conditions for causes. That is, it can certainly be the case that there are certain experiences that help set the stage for the discovery of God. but you cannot reduce the discovery of God to an ineluctable product of those circumstances, as if it was just triggered by them and not something real in itself. That's, I think, largely what he's doing in chapter 1. So if you want more on that, go ahead and read that chapter. Okay, I think this is the big insight that de Lubac offers, that is, he would argue, very traditional. And so far as I understand the world, there are some scholars who would debate whether that's the case. But without getting stuck in the weeds there, let's just say the thesis. So de Lubac says that God is always known implicitly, even if we might need reflection and analysis to know him explicitly. So de Lubac takes the line that all of us know God. There's no way around it. Because of who we are as spiritual creatures, we cannot but know God implicitly. He would say that every act of the intellect and the will, it can focus on something mundane, something in the world, something particular. And so the explicit object of our attention is just one finite thing in the world. However, he says that in every knowledge of the finite, there is always some kind of knowledge of the infinite. You could say that God is like this horizon that we may never look at in itself, except maybe rarely, we can look at the horizon. But even when we try to look at the horizon, we only see it in light of a further horizon that we're not seeing. You can always walk ever more into the horizon. You never catch up with it and look at it as one more object among many others. It always has this presence to you that's kind of indirect, kind of outside what you are focused on objectively. And so de Lubac is saying that all our human acts are like that. And we may not always pay attention to the horizon. We may only look at the things that emerge within the horizon, but that doesn't mean we don't, in fact, see in some way the horizon. So what he says exactly here as a quotation is, every human act, whether it is an act of knowledge or an act of will, rests secretly upon God by attributing meaning and solidity to the real upon which it is exercised. That's very significant. I hope to make that phrase clear when we talk later about Anselm and Newman, that it rests upon God by attributing meaning and solidity to the real upon which it is exercised. So the act of the will and intellect, when they are exercised upon something concrete, in the measure that you grant meaning and solidity to the reality in front of you, in that measure, you are also resting secretly upon God. For God is the absolute, and nothing can be thought without positing the absolute in relating it to that absolute. Nothing can be willed without tending towards the absolute, nor valued unless weighed in terms of the absolute. When we look at some of the classic proofs, I'm going to suggest that it's basically this form, that everything is being discovered in relation to something absolute. And that absolute is necessary for the rational activity that all those different arguments presuppose. De Lubac here says he's leaning on an axiom enunciated by St. Thomas Aquinas. So again, he wants us to think and to believe him that he's expressing something very traditional, although some people debate that. Aquinas says that all knowers know God implicitly in all they know. He's also leaning, and I think, so far as I understand the world of scholarship, this is where people will want to criticize him. He's also leaning, in his interpretation of Aquinas, on more recent scholars like Maurice Blondel and Joseph Marechal. And those figures, emerge in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. They are, founders of a new way of understanding Thomas, that they would contend is authentic Thomas, but others would debate that. And so it's there where, so far as I understand, this very profound point of de Lubac about God is challenged by some people today. Okay, but we won't get into that. So anyway, like the horizon to the eye, God is always known in our every act of intellect and will. Here is just the quotation from Aquinas and De Veritate. All cognitive beings also know God implicitly in any object of knowledge. Just as nothing has the note of appetibility except by a likeness to the first goodness, so nothing is knowable except by a likeness to the first truth. In other words, anything desirable to the will, appetible, is appetible only insofar as it participates or is like the absolutely appetible, the fullness of goodness, the fullness of the desirable. And so it's just like I only know this one good thing in light of a horizon of absolute goodness. Similarly, an individual thing is knowable only insofar as it's like the first truth, the eminently knowable, the absolutely knowable, that in which it participates in order to be knowable at all. So once again, the finite in light of a horizon. Okay, de Lubac, here's another important point from his work that I want to spend a moment on. De Lubac would say, I think, that reason is constituted in relation to the absolute. So it's not that first you've got a mind that's independent and autonomous in itself and then goes off searching for God. No, it's in the very knowledge of the mind of itself, and what it is in its being, that its relationship to God is discovered. One cannot sever the mind's relation to the absolute thought as real, without destroying the mind itself. Unless we are to close the door to all philosophy worthy of the name, we cannot refuse to acknowledge that basic experience, the presence, namely, what basic experience? Namely, the presence of non-conceptual being to consciousness, which is common to the philosopher and to all men. Now, just to use familiar language from the last slide about horizon, he's talking about the basic experience, namely the presence of non-conceptual being. So being that is absolute, being that is not delimited by a concept or an essence or something that would present it to our mind in a finite form. So I think, if we're going to use the same imagery, that we could say that the horizon is limitless. It's non-conceptual in the sense that it has no limit. You cannot put a box around it. You cannot comprehend the horizon. The horizon is precisely what comprehends you. That first experience of being enveloped by the real, by being that in a way that's not reducible to concepts. That's, I think, what de Lubac is saying, this relation to the absolute that enters into the very constitution of reason itself. Then the next quote: if the mind did not affirm God, if it were not the affirmation of God. I love that. Like, the mind doesn't just stand up and say, I affirm God. The mind, if it is what it is an affirmation of God. If it's doing what we like to think it's doing, knowing the true, knowing the good and so forth, and willing the good, then it is an affirmation of God. It's not something it does later. It, by its very activity, is a screaming affirmation of the reality of God. So if the mind did not affirm God, it could affirm nothing whatsoever. It would be without laws, like a world deprived of its sun. It could no longer exercise any rational activity and could only sink back into the dark limbo of obscure psychical subjectivism. It could no longer judge. It would have lost its light, its norm, its justification, its point of reference, the one thing which can serve as a foundation for all else. This is again another quote that I hope to make intelligible and credible when we read very quickly some of the classical proofs. God is the measuring rod by which we judge, by which we reason. And if we deny him, we deny the rod by which we reason. And so what are we doing then? We're lost, de Lubac would say, in a dark limbo of obscure psychical subjectivism. If I am not allowed to affirm an absolute goodness that measures everything else, well, what am I doing when I say this is better than that, or I prefer this over to that? If that is a rational activity, preferring one thing to another, evaluating relative goodness, it's only because I have a measuring rod by which to measure rationally, intelligibly, all the different goods that present themselves to me. And so if I deny that rod, then I'm lost, de Lubac would say, in some obscure psychical subjectivism. I cannot rationally compare things, judge things, and so many other activities that we prize in the life of our mind. Okay, this does not mean, so this basic experience that we all have doesn't mean for de Lubac that the proofs of God are superfluous, or that we all have this inevitable intuition of the reality of God. De Lubac doesn't want to, to argue that. The fact that we cannot but know God doesn't mean the fact that we cognitively do always know him. He's not known to us in simple terms, as explicitly, or however you want to put it. So de Lubac says that does not mean that reasoning, according to logical principles, in order to prove the existence of God is superfluous, but that the thought, which is our affirmation of God, is not the conclusion of an argument. The thought which reasons comes before the reasoning. And if reasoning must perforce intervene, that is in order to show us what thought consists in, or what it implies. So what is he saying here? I think he's saying that, okay, we don't prove God as the conclusion at the end of an argument. We discover him as the one who makes possible all arguing. So if I think I have this autonomous, independent, rational life, and then I go off to the races to try to prove God, like I try to prove it's going to rain tomorrow, or any other conclusion that doesn't enter into, whose reality doesn't enter into the constitution of the very act of arguing, then I'm not understanding God for de Lubac. He's not what comes at the end. The thought which reasons comes before the reasoning. Hopefully that makes some sense. But in other words, what we're doing in this kind of demonstration, when we're demonstrating something like God, is we're realizing something we already knew. It's like a recognition of, you only recognize things that you in some sense already knew and are just now calling forth to mind. I think that's a very, very traditional way of describing the discovery of God, namely not as the end of a conclusion where the premises didn't already have laden within them the reality of God, but rather the teasing out of an implicit knowledge, and therefore the discovery of God is a kind of recognition, like, oh yeah, of course. Anselm, for example, when he talks about his method in the Monologion, which is one of the places where he proves God's existence, he says that whatever I said in this book is put forth in the role of someone who, by thought alone, so he's not relying on scriptural authority or anything like that, disputes and investigates within himself things that he had not previously realized. Animad verticet is the word in Latin he used. So things that he hadn't directed his mind to, directed his soul to before. They were there, but things he just didn't notice, things he hadn't previously realized. Okay, here's just another quote about the relationship between dialectics or discursive reasoning, or something like a proof, and the basic experience of God. Another quote from de Lubac. The idea of the one God springs up spontaneously at the heart of consciousness. At the very beginning, then, there is an encounter, a contact, a certain apperception. Once the idea of the living God has fallen like a seed into consciousness, whether by the light of reason or as the result of a supernatural revelation, it certainly is subjected, like all other ideas, to dialectic. So once we've got the idea, we can certainly go back and look at it and sort of explore it. Nonetheless, it remains substantial and positive, and that is what ensures its victory. Far from corresponding to a phase in human dialectic, it is, on the contrary, dialectic which plays the intermediary role, linking in its process a reality already perceived and a mystery surmised, without ceasing to be sustained in its movement by a presence. Okay, now to Newman. Way too much text in this PowerPoint. I'm sorry, I'm still growing my own abilities here to make helpful PowerPoints. So I think that this is a good time to turn to Newman. Now, hopefully, when you read Grammar of Assent, you saw these passages about the idea of God, and perhaps they struck you. So one of the ways in which Newman argues for the personal character of rational arguments about concrete matters, the idea that we cannot reduce reason to something that can be translated into impersonal processes and just a system of rules, but something that always depends upon, the personal judgment and the expertise and the perceptive abilities of the concretely reasoning mind. When he's arguing that in chapter 8 and chapter 9, he uses an example, one of many, to show the personal character of reasoning. And that example is the idea of God. Where does that idea come from? Can that idea be translated into impersonal concepts and processes and rules? And then we'll say, no, it can't. And so to make his argument, he presents two passages, one from a guy named Leighton and another from a guy named Coleridge, to show how these authors draw the idea of infinity from finite experience. After he presents their very dense citations, he notes how few readers will enter into either premise or conclusion of these arguments. And thus the authors represent their words more as aids for reflection rather than instruments for compulsion. So many authors, when they're describing the idea of God, they can't reduce it into a deductive argument, a demonstration, because of the very character of the idea and also the nature of reason itself, Newman would argue. And so thus it is plain that if the passage is worth anything, we must secure that worth for our own use by the personal action of our own minds, or else we shall be only professing and asserting its doctrine without having any ground or right to assert it. And our preparation for understanding and making use of it will be the general state of our mental discipline and cultivation, our own experience, our appreciation of religious ideas, the perspicacity and steadiness of our intellectual vision. So I think that this is already some help, hopefully, in explaining that tension that I enunciated earlier at the beginning of the presentation, where we can look at some of the classical proofs or ancient philosophers and theologians who talk about the idea of God and see kind of, yeah, that sort of makes sense, but gosh, I can't say that I've really entered into that in a way that is really very persuasive for me. I am not enraptured by the idea of God as I think Lubac really was, or Newman. And Newman would say, yeah, okay, that's normal. That's very normal. Everything depends on your ability to become as expert in this idea, just like a cook becomes expert in its own sphere. And just like you cannot take the cook's super abundant personal concrete knowledge of taste and different combinations and everything and dump that into a 10,000 page science book. So too the ability for the individual to discover the idea of God takes a lifetime of cultivation, of habit, of experiences, of reflection, of perception, just like the cook. And it's not a skill that can be translated into an impersonal rule book, no matter how many pages it is. And so Aquinas too, when he offers his 5 ways, I mean, they're so short. I think they are just like these passages from Leighton or Coleridge in the sense that they're aids for reflection. They are not an impersonal system of rules that will compel every human being that reads them. No, they presume so much of our sense of taste, as it were, for religious ideas, our ability to be sensitive and to know the realities about which Thomas is speaking. Okay. Let's just skip this one because we're already getting really long. And let's skip this one. Let's go straight to Anselm now, his method in the Monologion proof. So here's one of the first classical arguments I want to look at. Anselm is talking in the prologue to the Monologion about the different methodological restrictions that his brothers in the monastery have placed on his project. Namely, they don't want him to lean on authority, the authority of scripture or whatever else. So Anselm says, they prescribe the following form for me in writing this meditation. Absolutely nothing in it would be established by the authority of scripture. Rather, whatever the conclusion of each individual investigation might assert, the necessity of reason would concisely prove, and the clarity of truth would manifestly show that it is the case. Now, whatever I said there is put forth in the role of someone who, by thought alone, disputes and investigates within himself things that he had not previously realized. It would take us too far afield to go into this, but here you see, hopefully, Anselm saying that he's going to rely upon reason alone, in the Latin sola ratione, and he's not going to appeal to an extrinsic authority of faith. Now, some people have interpreted Anselm as a kind of proto-rationalist. I would argue, and I'll show you in the next slide why, that this is so far from rationalism. He is not saying that he will dispense with all faith. And the reason is that he sees in the very life of the mind itself, in the life of reason itself, the role for faith. And what he's saying here is he's not going to rely on an extrinsic authority, but that doesn't mean he brackets all faith, because Anselm sees in the very life of the mind its dependence upon faith. And so I think Anselm is a tremendous example of that image of St. John Paul II, Fides et Ratio, where faith and reason are like two wings of a dove, of the human spirit rising in contemplation of the truth. You cannot get reason alone in the modern sense, that is, where you are bracketing all faith whatsoever. Such a thing doesn't exist. It's a kind of chimera or an abstraction. And when Anselm therefore talks about reason alone, he does not mean reason apart from all faith. He just means that he's going to dwell within his own mind right now and see what are the presuppositions that my mind must make in faith. Okay. His argument in the Monologion, this is how it begins. He says, if anyone does not know, either because he has not heard or because he does not believe, that there is one nature supreme among all existing things, who alone is self-sufficient in his eternal happiness, who through his omnipotent goodness grants and brings it about that all other things exist or have any sort of well-being, and a great many other things that we must believe about God or his creation. I think he could at least convince himself of most of these things by reason alone, if he is even moderately intelligent. Notice here that when Anselm sets out to prove God, he's talking about a pretty specific reality. He has in mind already the meaning of that word God, and it's very dense. He's not talking about something like a flying spaghetti monster. So that image is silly, but it's something that a lot of the new atheists today accuse Christians of believing in. That is, they don't understand what we mean by the word God. They think we mean some, Superman who stands outside of our galaxy, but sometimes flies in really, really fast to make miracles happen. They haven't yet understood the depth of the reality that we're talking about when we talk about God. Okay, Anselm says then, there are many ways in which he could do this, namely prove God, but I shall set forth the one that I think would be easiest. After all, everyone desires to enjoy only those things that he thinks good. It is therefore easy for him to turn the eye of his mind sometimes toward investigating the source of the goodness of those things that he desires, only because he judges that they are good. Then, with reason leading and him following, he will rationally advance toward those things of which he is irrationally ignorant. Notice here that the interlocutor for Anselm, the one that is all that he's asking of the one who's going to follow him, is that this person be ready to desire and to judge something as good. That is, that person be willing to say, this watermelon is good. And by that, I mean something real. I'm not just saying this is good as a cipher for gimme. I'm saying, no, this watermelon is good. It is worthy of being desired. And I do also desire it. So that I think Anselm is all that he's asking at this point for this argument, that you're willing to judge things good and really mean that. Because by that experience, he thinks he can lead you by reason to recognize the measure by which you make that judgment. Okay, Anselm's argument in the Monologion. So then, someone might easily speak silently within himself in this way. Since there are countless goods, watermelons and a whole bunch of other things, whose great diversity we both experience through our bodily senses and discern through the reasoning of our mind, are we to believe that there is some one thing through which all good things whatsoever are good? Look how the rational activity of judging different things good and also comparing them has provoked in Anselm's reason a question of faith. Are we to believe that there's some one thing through which all goods whatsoever are good? Or are different goods good through different things? Indeed, to all who are willing to pay attention, it is clear and quite certain that all things whatsoever that are said to be more or less or equally a certain way as compared to each other are said to be so through something that is not understood as different, but rather as the same in diverse things. Okay, what does he mean there? So if I say, oh, this is a good watermelon, oh, and this is a good man, oh, no, this is a good book. I've used the same adjective there, good, certainly in analogous ways. But do they not have something common that would justify using the same word? Anselm would say, gosh, if there are such different things that are all worthy of being called good, they're all participating in different ways, to be sure, in some common reality. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to use the same adjective of them. Rational comparisons presuppose a kind of faith in a real commonality. There's a one beneath the many. If you say, I prefer this to that, this is better than that, you have declared that there's something in which these two participate that allows me to evaluate them. This has more or less participation, more or less of the goodness that measures them both. Now, who would doubt that this thing through which all goods exist is itself a great good? Therefore, he is good through himself, since every good exists through him. It follows, therefore, that all other things are good through something other than what they themselves are, and he alone is good through himself. So that one good through which all other good things become good is not good through something higher than himself, otherwise we've just punted our question back a level, in which case that new thing would be God. But once we finally get to the one good through whom all other things are good, there's nothing else for that thing to be good through except through itself. And that is a special way of existing. And that is an absolute kind of goodness. And that's something that all other goods depend on and are relative against. There is, we could say, an ontological difference between what exists through itself, or what's good through itself, and what exists through another. Here, in the experience of judgment, in the experience of the different grades of perfection and goodness, Anselm is beginning to discover the reality of God, that which exists in a totally different way from everything else that we know in our experience. How to make this argument more convincing? I hope that you can see, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I mean, at least in a very notional way, I definitely see how, a bunch of good things and have in common some goodness, some abstract thing I can call goodness. Newman says, however, these notional assents can become objects of real assent, and therefore persuasive, like real assent and real apprehension are for him, if you remember that bit from the grammar. They can become objects of real assent the more we know they're objects in relation to the real particulars to which they are associated. Take, for example, the first principle of true and false, or right and wrong. Newman says, these so-called first principles, I say, are really conclusions or abstractions from particular experiences. However, in proportion as we obey the particular dictates which are its tokens, so are we led on more and more to view it in the association of those particulars, which are real, and virtually to change our notion of it into the image of that objective fact, which in each particular case it undeniably is. So I think the idea here is that the more committed we are to the reality of the particular goods we experience in our lives, the more coherently we behave in light of that affirmation of their reality, the more the being that makes them possible will also be grasped with a kind of real apprehension in the grasping of those particulars. So do you want to have a real apprehension of goodness itself? Be consistent and constantly judge and will good things. If you want to have a real apprehension of truth itself, be consistent and constantly judge and will true judgments. Live in a way that is beholden to this transcendent goodness, and you will see it more clearly. The way we live and our very power to think are connected. Just think what my apprehension of truth would be like if I so casually told lies. Would I be convinced of the reality and goodness, the desirability of truth, If I choose other, I am weakening my own apprehension of the truth and goodness of the particular when I deny it. Now, when I choose it and live consistently and am in good conscience and always willing the true and the good, their reality becomes stronger and stronger. It is something I perceive with greater and greater, more real apprehension. And then the coherence of all those real particulars, namely the one that makes the many good and true, is something that I'm also apprehending with more real apprehension. Okay, we'll close here with just maybe a few more minutes on Aquinas and his 5 ways. I cannot go through all the 5 ways just for lack of time, but I want to give you hopefully just the essence or some pointers that will hopefully help you understand the points from Lubac and Newman, and therefore discover them in a deeper way in your own reading. So the first way is from change your motion, and the short form of it would be that everything that is in actuality has been brought to that actuality out of a state of potentiality. That is the most general description of motion, or properly change. So it's not motion in the locomotive sense. It's motion in the sense of any change from one state to another, any arrival out of potentiality into actuality. And Aquinas says that because of the reality of change and motion, which we see everywhere, there must be something that is pure actuality, that is not itself brought from potentiality to actuality. Otherwise, none of this would be. There would be no movement. There would be no change. There would be no movement from reduction or movement from potentiality to actuality, because everything that is in motion has been put into motion. And if everything is put into motion by something prior to it, well, then nothing gets started. So there must be something that's in motion already, that is already fully actual, without needing something to push it from potentiality to actuality. And that, Aquinas says, everyone understands to be God. Then he's got his way from efficient causality. So it's different, but it also depends on the impossibility of an infinite regress. It's different from the first argument, but it also depends, like the first argument, on the impossibility of an infinite regress, but this time of efficient causes. In the way of contingency, so everything in reality that we experience didn't have to be. It's not necessary. And if everything is not necessary, well, then there's no way, Aquinas says, to account for why anything is. This is the question that Heidegger will pose later in a way that seems to me he thinks is original, or at least something that's been obscured in the Middle Ages, which, if you just read Aquinas, I think is pretty clear it isn't. And I mean, why is there something rather than nothing? Aquinas asks the same question. I mean, nothing has to be. Why is there something here? Well, the reason there's something here is that, well, there just must simply be something that does have to be. Because if everything didn't have to be, then there would be no way to account for why anything is. And this necessary we all call God. And then finally, there's the way of gradation and comparison, which is, I think, just the same argument Anselm gives in the Monologion, so I won't repeat it. And then there's the way of universal governance, or the order that Aquinas sees in all things. Everything acts in ways that are intelligent, that are intelligible, that can be understood by me, by reason. Now, the frog doesn't have reason, so why does it behave rationally? Well, Aquinas would say that the one that makes everything in the world intelligible, behaving in a rational way, whether it's the law of gravity or the squirrel running around, that one we call God. Now, notice, just to throw it out there, is there some significance? I'm not sure. I'm still thinking about this. In the different subjects discovering God. So first Aquinas says everyone, and then all men, but then he switches to we and we. So I'm wondering if there is some difference in the 5 ways between the idea of God that all men, Christian or not, can come to, and the idea of God that particularly Christians can come to. Do this 4th and 5th way, this assertion of absolute goodness and beauty that literally cross across all being and are everywhere, and namely that everything really is ordered to an end? Are those connected to the Christian reason? I'm not sure exactly. I don't know, but I just throw it out there. And then also, is there some significance to the different acts in which God is affirmed? So here it's interesting. Aquinas says in the first way that this everyone understands to be God. So I think it could be that we understand God without necessarily even naming him. So this is a kind of really deep implicit knowledge of God. But then there's the way of efficient causality, which everyone gives the name of God to that thing. Similarly, the way of contingency, that necessary being we'll speak of as God. And the fourth and fifth way, we call God. So here I'm wondering if there's some significance between the difference between understands and the various verbs of naming, perhaps. But I also want to point out what I think is significant, namely that the idea of God is discovered as something we name. So you name things that are in your world of experience. Like you bump up against this thing and you give it a name. So you know how to refer to it. I think that in the experience of the mind or the intellect and will, when we're sufficiently reflective, we notice things. And we notice this absolute reality that we can arrive at in least 5 different ways. And when we bump up against that, okay, that's what I mean by God. I do not mean, some Superman or some Fix-It or some Santa Claus. I mean the one that makes it possible for me to search for intelligible causes everywhere I look. By the word God, I mean the one that I named, the one that makes it possible for anything to be. I mean the one that I am always referring to whenever I compare different goods, because that one, the absolute goodness, is the one that allows me to do that. So there's something immediate about the knowledge of God that is then unfolded in these proofs. The one we discover is one that we name, the one that's sort of immediately present to us. I hope that this helps make sense of de Lubac's point that what we discover at the end of the proof is not some conclusion that's just there on paper, but we're discovering something about our own experience. We're recognizing something that is always present to us, whether or not we've gone through the arguments themselves. Okay, so here's just the final slide. What the heck is reason, if not a marvelous mirror? What is reason, if not the pre-apprehension and thus a constant reflexive search for the absolute actuality, the first way, the absolute agency, the second way, the absolute being, the third way, absolute perfection, the fourth way, absolute order, fifth way, behind all things? How could we reason without faith in this source of life, in whose light we see light, to quote the psalm? So at the end of the day, it seems to me that this intuition or this idea from de Lubac is really justified, that the discovery of God is connected to the discovery of ourselves. That is the depth of ourselves, the mystery of the human being. The life of our mind and heart, our intellect and will, is a mirror for the absolute by which it lives. The truth we seek, the goodness we search for, this very quest, when we turn back upon it and are reflective of it, we recognize within ourselves a light that is standing on us like a mirror. And the more we open to it, the more we trust it, the more we accept the coherence of our minds and hearts in relation to God, the more we live our lives and think our thoughts in relation to that absolute, the more we know everything in relation to that absolute, and the more persuasive all these arguments become for us that this discovery we've made is coherent and logical and eminently defensible dialectically. Proofs for God. Okay, ciao, ciao, and have a great day.